All right, well, sounds like you can hear me, so I think we're back on now. All right, so we'll get going. All right, yeah, so welcome to our next installment of the monthly chat with the Archaeologist. Just got a little bit of like I said, seem to be having some technical difficulties that got us a little bit delayed starting, but we should be underway now. Yeah, there's going to be what you're seeing right now is, yeah, just the cover. You're not going to be seeing my face this week. We're having some other technical difficulties, so no webcam this week. You're just going to have to, I guess, sorry that you have to miss my beautiful face. You'll just have to focus on some beautiful slides here. So yeah, in light of the upcoming June solstice, summer solstice, we'll be talking about archaeoastronomy this week. So to dive right in, we're going to first cover what is archaeoastronomy, how do we define it as a field of study, what does that field of study contain. Go into hopefully a little bit of a, not too much of a rabbit hole about common principles that we find in archaeoastronomical observations. What are the common things that we're looking for? And then, of course, what are the methods of how we define it, how we identify it. Then we'll go through a bit of a list of examples of just when and where do we find it. What regions, what peoples, what cultural traditions, and at what time periods in the past. And then what are some of the pitfalls of archaeoastronomy, as well as especially paying attention to some of the critiques. Finally, we'll wrap up with what is the future of archaeoastronomy and how do current methods address some of these critiques and where is there room to continue to improve. So to expand a little bit on this common principles point you see, some of the basic concepts we'll cover is how archaeoastronomy is used for keeping time, such as calendars, how it has been used for navigation, and also how it is used as a mode of storytelling. And then just to touch on some of the examples that we'll be covering, we'll begin picking up with a topic that we left off on, I think, last month, with how the Hopewell used alignments of architectural features to time particular events, not just solstices and equinoxes, but to really fine-tune their understanding of the time of year as a part of their horticultural practices for cultivating non-domesticated crops. Next we'll go to, you may have heard of these people, the Maya from Central America. So we'll be talking about Maya uses of astronomical observations and the significance in the Maya culture and related cultures. And it wouldn't be an archaeoastronomy talk without addressing Polynesia. Sorry, Melanesia, I'm a little bit less familiar, but do understand that some of the principles we talk about with Polynesia are also going to be very applicable to Melanesia as well. Then we'll take it to some of my previous research in the Mojave Desert with the Shoshone and likewise also the Paiute, as well as the human-speaking Mojave people. Now, as a point of order, there are two different spellings of Mojave, M-O-J-A-V-E and M-O-H-A-V-E. Both have been used to describe both the desert and the peoples. However, I personally ascribe to the school or to the convention of using Mojave with a J to refer to the desert and Mojave with an H to refer to the people. Not everyone does it that way, but just so you know, in this and future talks, if I'm talking about Mojave with a J, that's the desert. Mojave with an H, that's the people, the ethno-linguistic group. And then we're going to bring it back home to the Tewa Pueblos and talk about the significance of astronomy to the Pueblos, particularly to the Tewa, to Pueblos considered ancestral to the Tewa, and of course to Mesa Prieta itself. So just some of the basics here. What is archaeoastronomy? Well, first the question you have to ask is if and how it was used. In other words, and we'll get this to the bottom of the slide too, archaeoastronomical observations always served a function. That function may have been deeply intertwined with religious life, but religious life continued to have pragmatic principles, and our division between those is really more of a modern one. So timekeeping. Knowing the time of year, the cycles, the annual cycles, as well as some of the, so in addition to the seasonal cycles, longer period timing as well. So keeping track of days, seasons, and those longer period times of years. Of course, there's also the lunar cycles, which help us keep track of the months within each season, and the movements of the planets, which the inner planets, of course, the inner planets will go through their cycles in less than a year, and the outer planets will go through their cycles in greater than a year. These were also observed in the ancient world and contributed to a broader understanding of astronomy. Archaeoastronomy was also used for, astronomy in the archaeological record was also used for navigation. And there's a few ways that this was done. One would be by tracing the arcs of heavenly bodies across the skies, as well as looking for zenith stars, stars that appear directly above a particular latitude. And finally, we'll also be talking about how astronomy was used for storytelling. I should clarify that while the word storytelling is a little bit inadequate, these, the oral traditions related to the sky are often much more powerful and fundamental to the cultural traditions to which they belong. They're not just stories, but they're ways of imparting morals. They're ways of explaining the order that the world has and why it has that particular order. Whether that order is the seasonal cycles and the things that happen within them, whether it's the placement of people and animals and plants and the things in the natural world. These stories are often related to the religious traditions, and so please don't think that I'm demeaning the quality of the stories too. And so we see that the stars and the constellations can sort of be used as mnemonics, as prompts to help remember these kinds of stories. You know, stories, I said again, of morality and of the cycles of the world. But also remembering the passing of exceptional celestial events, which we'll also have some examples. So I really just want to return to that astronomy is never just ceremonial, that division between the religious world and the pragmatic world is a modern distinction and pretty much a Western notion, and that these weren't necessarily separated but often intertwined in traditional societies. So, our slide's a little bit tiny. All right, sorry for the tiny picture. So some of the common observation pictures. Don't worry, we're gonna see. This is our logo down here in the lower right corner. Yeah, over here. We're going to talk about this one and its significance a little bit later. But yeah, let's get back to some of these common observation principles first. So, of course, the solar arc, the rise and set locations of the sun. This changes throughout the year. We have, of course, our solstices and equinoxes. At the equinox, the change in the rise and set position of the sun from day to day is actually at its fastest in the year, versus the change in the daily rise and set of the sun at both the summer and winter solstices is at its slowest. So sometimes we will call this the solar standstill. The term solar standstill is most often used, especially when we're talking about archaeoastronomy in the tropics. So yeah, the people will pay attention to the rise and set locations of the solar arc as it relates to both natural landscape features and to architectural constructions. Another set of observations will be the lunar cycles. So of course, the phases of the moon to count the days within the month. And a careful observer will notice nightly changes, going from crescent to half to gibbous to full, and then back down through that cycle. But, so of course the monthly waxing and waning, but also there are longer period cycles of lunar behavior as well. We'll touch on that, especially when we talk about the Maya calendar. This is when the astronomical significance of observing the moon shifts away from timing those seasonal changes to more that long-term sort of timekeeping, as well as some have used it to try to predict some of those exceptional astronomical events, such as solar and lunar eclipses. Also, the behavior of the planets was closely examined by some cultures, but not all. Particularly Venus is very prominent, being the brightest planet from our vantage point in the solar system. And its particular cycles are rather interesting and seemingly unique in the parts of the sky visible to the human eye. Also, constellations seem to be observed. We sometimes see this reflected in the alignment of architecture, but we also see it reflected in the visual culture, in the images that are recorded, such as with petroglyphs, like the example in the lower right. Constellations also have rising and setting locations, or star arcs, and the interesting thing about these is that while its zenith position, its highest point in the arc will change throughout the year, constellations tend to rise and set from the same location. And so by observing these carefully, you can get an idea of what the rise and set location is. It positions you somewhere on the globe at a particular latitude. So we'll talk about that more with when we get to Polynesia. But also the contents of the constellations are reminders of stories, prompts, mnemonics. And so this is also something to consider, that constellations weren't just a device for keeping position, but also for remembering those important cultural stories. Constellations are also seasonal, not in that they fail to rise or set, but from our vantage point, it would appear that the sun moves through different constellations throughout the year, because as the Earth rotates around the sun, the line drawn from the Earth to any given constellation is at some point going to pass through the sun, at which point it becomes difficult to see. what we seem to find in the seasonality of constellations is that their seasonal significance is often tied to the time that they return to the early evening sky, and is less often tied to when they are in the early morning sky in the pre-dawn hours. And then, of course, we'll touch on some of the exceptional astronomical events. There are many examples of these, and I'm not going to touch on a whole lot of them, but yeah, these, of course, include supernova, meteor showers, meteorite impacts, and and in addition to meteorite impacts, meteor showers, supernova, of course, solar and lunar eclipses. So let's get into how archaeoastronomy might be indicative of timekeeping. Right? So again, the most obvious is going to be that shifting of the rising and setting locations of the sun, the passage of the solar arc as a marker of the seasons. Here at Mesa Prieta, there are to the east the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and the series of peaks and saddles along this chain of mountains to the east gives very useful markers that really contrast the positions of the sun between the seasons. It becomes very clear that in the winter the sun rises over certain peaks, versus the summer it rises in a very different part of that chain. Again, I was just talking about the visibility of constellations and the seasonality of the visibility of constellations, and so that is something to consider when, or in tandem with the stories associated with those constellations. Often those stories are also connected to events linked with the return of that constellation, and I'll give an example of that as we keep moving. Of course, there's the monthly lunar cycles, so the phases of the moon throughout the month, and the number of full moons experienced over a period of time, and the longer period behavior. Like I said, we'll get to that when we talk about Maya uses of astronomy. So, yeah. For the moon, the longer period behavior is there is an 18.6 year period of lunastices. Again, we'll talk about that when we get to the Maya. But other longer period behaviors are things like the planets. So Venus as the morning and evening star, and switching between morning and evening star. This has been conceptualized in different cultures in different ways. Some cultures, like, again, when we get to the Maya, made a connection between the morning and evening star, understanding that these were two aspects of the same thing. Others conceptualized Venus as the morning star as a different heavenly body from Venus as the evening star. Jupiter, some of you may be aware of, especially if you follow astrology, tends to spend a year in each constellation as it moves through each constellation that it moves through. This may have actually helped define these constellations, at least within the classical Greco-Roman set of constellations. So Jupiter moves through the sky in I believe it's a 13-year pattern. So, finally, navigation, the rise and set locations of the solar arc. Again, the star arcs become very important, and this is something you want to measure right as star is rising and right as it is setting. And finally, the contents of the constellations and the orientation with them. Zenith stars, as I mentioned, are stars that appear directly overhead for a given latitude. So this was closely observed, especially by seafaring island cultures, which is why Polynesia is included in our examples. Finally, storytelling. Those constellations are related to important characters in oral traditions. These stories often contain themes of morality. They may help us remember culture heroes, important historical, or sometimes maybe they weren't actually a historical figure but come to be considered one. Culture heroes, right? And of course, it's worth mentioning that the stars have often been connected with ancestors in the afterlife. So, another aspect of the storytelling is the exceptional events. We'll talk a little bit about the supernova of 1064, which was observed around the world and recorded by a number of different cultures. Also, passing comets are noteworthy. These are also transient events that happen at sort of irregular times and are thus considered exceptional. Meteor showers have been recorded in the visual culture of various cultures. We're not going to dive so much into these examples, but you may have seen some, say, paintings of frightened people running from the rain of fire from the sky. And so that's an example of how we see these recorded. And meteorite impacts. This is another one that I'm not going to dwell on too much, but I'm sure many or all of you are familiar with at least one example of how the residual materials of a meteorite have come to gain religious significance. And why shouldn't they? I mean, these things fell from the heavens, after all. So how do we identify archaeoastronomical markers? Well, many approaches have been used, but historically, archaeologists have approached this from two really different schools of thought. One is incidental observations. These are, whether by investigating an informed hunch or by happenstance and a lot of patience. You notice a conjunction between a shadow, between a ray of light, between a notch in a corner of a building and the rising and setting of the sun, the moon, or a particular star. Especially these sorts of observations are made around the solstices and equinoxes, presumably important times. So this is the most common technique for noting the passage of light and shadow. It is not the only one, but when we see studies and suggestions of astronomically significant archaeological evidence, features, constructions, petroglyphs, the studies that contain the use of light and shadow often are built upon such incidental observations. Also, we have computational observations, studying the mathematical relationships between these features and designs, identifying similarities with celestial objects or events. Now, computational observations, the mathematics involved get very complex very quickly. You need your declination, your azimuth, your right ascension. So these are ways of measuring the arcs of the sky as it relates to the Earth itself, and of measuring the orientation of the observer on the Earth. And these calculations actually get rather complex, especially at latitudes away from the equator. So the mathematics get very complex, and then these computational approaches often also take into account the fact that the night sky, as steady as it might seem, save for the planets and occasional comets, is actually dynamic and changing. The positions of the stars as they are today are not exactly where they were in the past, nor is the seasonality the same, nor is the seasonality necessarily the same. So the further back in time we go, the greater and greater these differences become. It may not be so much of a difference when we're looking only 500 years into the past, but when we project our studies back into times like the Neolithic, which is 10,000 or more years ago, then the night skies might have looked very different, and we have to take into account some of the changes to the axial tilt of the Earth, to the changes in the seasonal cycle, and longer period changes to the Earth's orientation and orbital parameters that we call Milankovitch cycles. So yeah, again, the mathematics for computational observations get very complex very fast. So where and when is archaeoastronomy found? Where do we find astronomical observations in the archaeological record? Well, yeah, virtually anywhere you look hard enough. And there is a critique to be said of that. We'll get to the critiques later. But we're just going to go through some examples first. So first we're going to give a few examples of timekeeping. As I said, we'll start with Hopewell. Hopewell was the cultural zenith of the Adena culture of the eastern woodlands of the United States. So Adena and Hopewell. Hopewell was directly descended from Adena and just the cultural zenith. Next, of course, we'll talk about the Maya. I'm sure some of you are excited for that. And then we'll get into Polynesia. So we'll touch on examples of navigation. And within navigation, of course, mostly we're going to be focusing on Polynesia. But again, like I said, even though I don't know as much about Melanesia, you should consider, or you should remember that most of the principles that we know about with Polynesian uses of Polynesian uses of astronomy, rather, are applicable to Melanesia. And then some examples of storytelling. This is where we're going to talk about Mojave Desert peoples, Paiute, Shoshone, and Mojave. And then we're going to bring it back home to the Tewa Pueblos and focus a bit on Mesa Prieta, as well as some of the related communities. Finally, examples of exceptional events. Mostly we'll focus on that supernova of 1054. Officially, the name of it, SN 1054, just means supernova 1054. So, like I said, the Hopewell was the cultural zenith of the long-enduring Adena culture and the Ohio River drainage in the sort of Great Lakes area between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains, around the Ohio River Basin and its tributaries, particularly the Ohio and Scioto rivers, south of the Great Lakes. We have some great examples, and in fact, all four of the examples that I'm showing you here are on, they're all very close to each other in the general area of Newark, Ohio. So shout out to my Buckeyes out there if you get a chance. Go check them out. I see you all in the chat, so no excuses. So yeah, we've got a lunar observatory at the Newark Octagon. This observes the lunar standstills, or lunastices. So I was talking about how the solstices are also known as the solar standstills. Well, the moon also has solstices, although it gets a little bit more complicated. You may have noticed we already had our supermoons for this year. We're done with supermoons for this year. We had a whole lot of supermoons last year, and a supermoon is basically when the moon is at its perigee, at its closest approach to Earth, around the time that it's also full. So it does appear bigger in the sky. Although much of this effect is, from focusing in on it too. We tend to scale our perception to that. So the actual amount by which it's bigger in the sky it only takes up like an extra degree or two, but boy does it seem bigger. And these are lunastices, or lunar standstills, and there seem to be observation points at the Newark Octagon that align very well with the ideal positions from which to record these. They don't always happen at the full moon, but they are most noticeable. We also have a couple of earthworks, the Fairground Circle and the Hopeton earthworks, that seem to have been used for observing the winter solstice sunrise. Now, of course, for those of you who haven't spent a winter in Ohio, it's cold. Now, I mean, it's not like Canada cold, but it's not warm and would be a very unpleasant and difficult experience, as some of the researchers who have worked in that area, I'll have to add them to the description here. There will be a list of references at the end of the slideshow. So look for that for the references. But yeah, they note that the winter solstice is you're going to be cold and shivery, and that makes it hard to track celestial objects because you're shivering. But you can't have a fire because the smoke and the light are going to inhibit your ability to make the observation. And so what we see at the Fairground Circle is there is actually a rectangular structure backing the observation point, so that you can be inside of the structure with your back to a wall, but looking out an open area, so you're a little bit warmer in here and able to make the observations. I also want to talk about Mound City and the sighting gaps in the earthworks, and that's our tie-in to last week's topic of agriculture and horticulture, because while there weren't necessarily expressly domesticated crops, they were definitely raising crops of local grains, and the planting and harvesting seasons seem to have been timed by sighting gaps in the earthworks, especially the planting season, by observing the May cross quarter. So the cross quarter is the point halfway in between the equinox and the solstice. My favorite cross quarter, of course, is Halloween. Little personal fact. So yeah, moving on from timing agriculture off of these observation points to on earthen architecture, to timing agriculture on observation points off of built architecture, and also doing a lot more with those observations than just agriculture. The field of archaeoastronomy really became mainstream because of the studies done in the Maya area. Many credit Anthony Aveni's 1972 publication, but the tracking of the stars in Maya archaeology were also really capturing the zeitgeist of the late 60s and early 70s, and I'd even project that back to the early 60s. There was a lot of interest from both academics and the general public at the time, and this really made the field of archaeoastronomy take off. So one of the reasons why we were able to track these rather early on is because of the meticulously kept Maya calendar. In fact, numbers are one of the first things that we ever deciphered about the Maya hieroglyphic writing system. And so the calendar is one of the longest studied parts of Maya hieroglyphs, because we can recognize the numbers in those and explain the mathematical relationships of how they progress. It becomes very clear that it's a calendar. So we've got a long count. Now Maya had a base 20 system, so their year in the long count was 360 days long, not 364, because they wanted to keep it to an even 20. And then they have much longer cycles up to the Baktun is, I believe, 144,000 days. Someone wants to do the math on how many years that is. It's a lot. So there's also the calendar round to calibrate, because the long count is going to, you'll be going through your annual cycles on the long count in a way that just kind of creeps through the year, right? Like it doesn't begin at the same time every year. So they've also got this, it's essentially a two-digit, each digit is a number and a glyph, like a number and a name for the day, and then the other digit is a number and a name for the month. And this includes an actual 365-day year, along with another cycle within it too. And if it wasn't complicated enough, the Maya also had a lunar calendar that cycled back around every 6 lunar months. So this kept track of the age of the moon, which is the number of days within a lunar cycle. Also, it noted how many days are in that lunar cycle. So, because sometimes you have 28 and sometimes you have 29 days lunar cycles. And then there's also the Lord of the Night, which, from my understanding, taking this class more than 10 years ago, we still haven't deciphered what the Lord of the Night is. But it's probably related to these calendrical things. But of course, there's architecture and city planning involved. And so we see changes in preferred orientation. Overall, there across the entire Maya region, there seems to be a general orientation to the east, but sometimes we see local regional governments change that over time. And we do think that a lot of these changes, if they're changing to or from an easterly or northerly direction of observation, that they're doing so because of astronomical significance. Also, many buildings align to the solar standstill, aka solstices, sun, solar standstills. And we have very clear observatories, complete with iconography of the constellations, which kind of helps us tell us that they're observatories. The one at Chichen Itza also is round, kind of with a dome on the top, and it looks oddly like a modern observatory. No telescope, though. Like I said, this wouldn't be a talk about archaeoastronomy without talking about Polynesia. Polynesians used archaeoastronomy both for timing agriculture, definitely in agriculture. Many folks don't think about Polynesia as agricultural, but they were a strongly agricultural society, as well as we may know, more of you may know about the use of astronomy for navigation by Polynesians from the movie Moana. This actually observes it very well, using the hand as a sort of marker of the sky. It actually turns out that unless you've sustained severe injury during your developmental years or an amputation, the ratio of the size of your hand versus the length of your arm means that at full arm's length out, everybody's hand takes up about the same amount of degrees in your field of view. And so based on your full hand or a particular number of fingers or shape in the fingers, you can actually calculate how many degrees there are between the horizon and a star and between other objects in the sky. So this relates to a notion in modern Polynesian navigation called houses, which are essentially the embodied measures of azimuth, which is a measure of how far north or south something appears to be in the sky. And when I say embodied, because in this case, people are using their own bodies as the measuring device. We also see the use of zenith stars, the most famous of which for Hawaiians would be Hokulea, which in the classical Greco-Roman star naming would be the star Arcturus. It is currently the zenith star for the Hawaiian Islands, and has been sitting there for a little while. So Hokulea is the namesake of their of this, the canoe, the Hokulea, which in the 1970s there was a cultural revival, and based on the one remaining traditional Melanesian navigator, they were able to reconstruct a functional, now modern Polynesian means of navigation by this means. We think that all the physical principles are the same, just some of the cultural knowledge had to be reconstructed and may slightly differ from the past, but functionally we believe it to be the same as the past. And so, yeah, in the 1970s, they built this reproduction of a traditional Hawaiian sailing canoe, a va'a, which are the ocean-crossing canoes. And you may notice the shape of the sails and the how the hull kind of tweaks up at either end of each of the two hulls on this canoe. And that was actually reconstructed from the petroglyphs that we found on the Hawaiian Islands. So this is crossing out of archaeoastronomy into ethnoastronomy. In other words, sort of non-Western uses of astronomy, and actually now exemplifies a very living tradition today. We also see examples in the Mojave Desert. First off, geoglyphs. We see geoglyphs among the human peoples, including the Mojave, as well as the Numic peoples like Paiute and Shoshone. There have been suggestions that some of these have astronomical alignments. We don't think that those were really as significant for human, but there is a slightly stronger argument for Numic peoples like the Paiute and Shoshone, but even these are rather contentious, and some of the scholars who published on them still speculate that it might be more likely that these alignments are coincidental. We also have representations of constellations in the rock art record. What you see is a virtual panorama of a petroglyph site in the northern part of the Mojave Desert. The dark thing across the top here, this is actually an overhang. So we're inside of a shelter in this rock art site. Looking out, there's a bench. There's a row of flowers, which are in the oral traditions a reference to the Milky Way. We have these parallel lines, which if you look at the background, the Milky Way, we have these parallel light bands with a dark, dusty lane in the middle. So that's what we've got going on here. So we've got something that, this is the mnemonic that tells us it's the Milky Way, by referencing it through the metaphor of the flowery path, and it leads right up into these lines, across the room, and descend across this panel here. So just give me a moment to cue something up here. There we go. So if you'll look at this page, so this is a page from my dissertation. This is the same panel, just blown up a little bit more right here. This is the same panel that you see in the lower right of the screen. So you can see the context of where it is. So that those lines come across right here. Well, here's the constellation Orion. Here's the Milky Way coming through. You see this bright dot right there. Well, that's Betelgeuse. And here's Bellatrix. So Bellatrix is going to be at the tip of the tail of this sheep. We've got the belt. What we know is Orion's belt. Oh, sorry. Bellatrix is at the tip of the horns. The belt is the tail and back legs of this sheep. And then we have the upturned tail of this sheep. So that would be the dagger. Saiph would be the back hoof. Rigel, the nose. Now we have another sheep back here. So you can actually see how well these shapes fit with the constellation Orion. And this is known as the mountain sheep in the sky. This constellation was known to the Shoshone, to the Paiute, and to the Mojave. So we would assume that the Chemehuevi, in fact, yes, the Chemehuevi are actually explicitly mentioned as also having this constellation known as the mountain sheep in the sky in what we would call Orion. So this is, if you want to ask me what's one of the coolest finds I've ever encountered, yeah, a pretty grand constellation, I think, certainly tops the list. So all of that was just a warm-up to bring it back to the Tewa Pueblos. So knowledge and observation of constellations in the Tewa Pueblos was most likely kept by ritual specialists, religious authorities who kept track of the time and were able to give advice and influence the timing of the events in the Pueblo by their knowledge of the passing of the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars. This timing influenced the timing of dances and feasting, and as our own John Kinchelow notes, that the fall equinox is really the onset for it's the marker for the beginning of an intensification of the ritual calendar. We seem to have a number of solstice and equinox markers. These are believed to be very common in the Tewa world, as well as to areas ancestral to the Tewa. And that's kind of our transition to the last type of example. Thanks to Alyssa Richmond for providing this photo. This is the supernova glyph in Chaco Canyon near I want to say it's near Pueblo Blanco on the trail to it. Ignore the swallow nests. What you'll notice is the starburst and the crescent moon. We're not quite sure how the hand relates to this, but this is how we see the supernova of 1054 referenced around the world. So there are a lot of skeptics about these pictographs being of another supernova event, such as the supernova of 1006, which would have also been observable from Chaco Canyon, and was also after the onset of building the first monumental architecture there. So Chacoans would have observed the supernova of 1006, but that did not coincide with the crescent moon. The one of 1054 did. The supernova of 1054 was also recorded in detail in China, as well as, I believe, by the Greeks. So again, this was known around the world, and it's actually one of the first events that we see noticed on a global scale for which we have these sorts of documents. Chaco Canyon is of course considered to be ancestral to the Tewa, along with many other Pueblo groups. And so it should be no surprise that when we sort of flip the page over to Mesa Prieta, we find that we seem to have astronomical observations. On the left, you see observations from John Kinchelow, and on the right from Ron Barber. So we'll go to the left first. This is, you are probably familiar with this panel as containing our logo with this very beautifully executed animal flute player. What some of you may not know is how the shadow moves down on the equinox. It actually frames the tail and the back of the petroglyph. So in fact, it stalls there right at the sun's zenith, right at essentially solar noon. So we seem to have this intentional positioning of the petroglyph, not just positioning, but shaping of this petroglyph based on the shadow of the rock sitting above this panel. We also believe that this one is an astronomical observation in another sense, because the flute player is associated with this animal flute player might be the dog that's in the constellation that we know as the Big Dipper in Ursa Major. That constellation to the Tewa has been known as the dog or the dog's tail. So, and we might have an allusion to that. And similar to if you project that bighorn sheep on the constellation Orion, or those couple of bighorn sheep, and you notice how the shapes of the animals line up with the stars, you can kind of see how this is already in the shape of Ursa Major. Oh yeah, and then on the right we have an equinox glyph in which a shadow is cast across it. But not everyone's sold on archaeoastronomy, and like I said, there's some controversy around the one at Chaco Canyon. Well, it turns out that with very large data sets, say, for example, at Mesa Prieta, we have recorded 60,000 petroglyphs, and the list is just growing. Statistically, some of these will have alignments just by sheer happenstance. Incidental observations can be highly subjective and also prone to confirmation bias. And the importance of solstices and equinoxes can be something that we as modern day observers project onto the past. So it's important to reference back to these oral traditions. Like other folks at Mesa Prieta have in referencing back to the dog's tail as the constellation in the Tewa sky, like I do, referencing back to the mountain sheep in the sky for the Mojave and the Shoshone. This is a way of supporting our claims that these are astronomical observations. Especially stellar alignments are especially shaky because there are stars in virtually every direction. But computational approaches can help filter this out. I know we're starting to run low on time. And in fact, I think we're going to end this quite perfectly, because this is the last point that I want to make. Like I said at the beginning, the math gets complicated, but we've got tools to make this less complicated. So this is a program called Stellarium, and I just click over here, and right now we're in this is a virtual planetarium, and what we can do is we can view the sky from any angle at any time in any year from any location on Earth using Stellarium uses open source constellations, which means that non-Western, so we've been using the Western one, non-Western constellations can be contributed. So we can look at the navigator, the Polynesian Navigator's Triangle. Got the frigate bird. Got there's Maui's fishhook. Could go and change that. Want something more local? Got Navajo. And let's go. Let's end with Aztec. There you go, twisted foot. We get some constellation art there. Yeah, there we go. So you can even see the constellations. So that's the point that I kind of want to leave you on. Is that we now have new tools to do this in a much more sophisticated manner. And if you want to read more about this topic, there we go. For you want to read more about this topic, here are the references. I'm going to be putting all of these into the description as soon as this video is done recording. So thank you for tuning in. Looks like we're not going to have time for questions this week, but again, I appreciate you tuning in and watching, and I appreciate the support of everyone. And I do want to give a shout out to my coworker Amanda Fox. Amanda, thank you for directing me to some of this information about the archaeoastronomy at Mesa Prieta. So, yeah, cheers to that. And you all have a good weekend.